Hi there, my name is Teryl Taylor, and today alongside Fred Araujo, we're going to talk about improving cybersecurity hygiene through JIT patching. This work was done at IBM Research in the security department. But first, let's talk a little bit about enterprise cybersecurity and the challenges that it poses. One of the big challenges in enterprise cybersecurity is that most of the defenses are perimeter-based. And so we really don't get a good visual view of what's actually happening in the applications that are being attacked. Number two is that patch management is a significant challenge for these companies, which is made even worse by the fact that an application that is vulnerable is happy to tell an attacker that it is so. All the attacker has to do is ask, are you patched? If an application is yes, then the attacker can simply go on to the next application until it finds one that isn't patched, at which time it can send in an exploit and attack the server, stealing secrets and spreading itself out throughout the network. This creates an information asymmetry, whereby the attackers have actually more information about the network than the defenders. And the defenders have limited tools in order to defend themselves. They can do this perimeter-based defense, and they also have things like honeypots, which they can deploy, which are fortunately easily identifiable by attackers. So there are issues here. This is made worse by the fact that there is a significant window between when a vulnerability is introduced in an application and when a patch is actually deployed to deal with that vulnerability, a time over which we call the window of exposure, and where an attacker can have basically free reign to attack that application. There are different phases to this window of exposure. For example, when an exploit is released by the attacker, up until the time when that vulnerability is disclosed to the defender, we call this time period the time where there can be zero-day attacks on an application. But even when a vulnerability is disclosed, there is still significant time between when it's disclosed and when a patch can actually be deployed. This can also be several months, over which this time we call attacks in this period end-day attacks. And these are the types of attacks that we're actually looking at trying to mitigate through our techniques. The goal of this work is really to give the defender a view or visibility into these vulnerable applications over that end-day period of time. And we do this by enabling them to embed sensor patches into these applications, which can identify attacks on particular vulnerabilities and then react to those attacks and notify the defender. We do this by embedding what we call JIT patches or hot patches in vulnerable running applications to provide exploit sensing capabilities to identify threats, confuse attackers, and prioritize patches. We chose a hot patching model so that we can react to an ever-changing threat landscape very quickly. So in this way, for example, let's say we have an attacker who's attacked one of our systems that has a sensing patch. We can identify that the attack has occurred. We could redirect the attacker to particular sandboxes, notify our defender, and also push the attacker out of the network. Our agile patching technique, or JIT patching, can be used to enhance our vulnerability management within a company. It can allow us to essentially take a two-prong approach to patch development. Well, while that patch is going through testing, risk assessment, and development, we can deploy our sensing patches into vulnerable applications throughout our network to identify which applications are under attack in the wild typically, and we can provide this information to the security analyst so that these vulnerable applications can be protected while the patch is being developed and deployed. So how do we inject these threat sensing patches or JIT patches into live running legacy applications like Apache? Well, first we need to consider what Apache is. In this case, we're patching things like CVEs, which traditionally are small patches that include one or more functions. So essentially the idea behind our patching mechanism is to replace these functions inside of a running application with a threat sensing patch. To do so, we have an offline phase for patch synthesis, which essentially identifies our target function, and then we write a patch which looks for the vulnerability, a condition around the vulnerability, and then can allow the developer to add in a response should that vulnerability be triggered. So for example, drop the attacker into a sandbox or alert the security analyst. Once we've created our software patch, we can, using the application binary and symbols, compile that patch code into a bit code, which can then be injected alongside the symbols into our running application in our network. This will essentially then allow the application that's running to compile our patch bit code into a machine code so that it can be runnable inside of the application. From there, we're going to take our newly compiled function and link it in to the application through a function trampoline. This essentially allows our application to seamlessly start using the new threat sensing function rather than the existing original one. When the attacker attacks the system and the vulnerability clause is triggered, then we can invoke our response, whether it is set the booby trap to drop the attacker into a sandbox that we can then monitor, or whether we can alert. Note that these JIT patches do not affect the original functionality of the application, meaning that benign users will not trigger these applications. It is going to be attackers that are trying to attack particular vulnerabilities. Here we have our JIT patching architecture. So on the left-hand side, we see the offline process, whereby we have our patch source and our application binary of interest, and we pass this through a synthesizer, which uses LLVM to compile our patch source into bitcode and extracts a set of symbol maps from the application. We then have a hooking agent, which bootstraps our application of interest, running application, with a thread. And it also injects a set of libraries like libjit to compile down our patch into machine code, which then is injected into the original process flow using our trampoline as described before. While the hooking agent does this, it can remove our libjit compiler and essentially allow the trampoline to be in place. Now we'll see how we can use our JIT patching framework on a set of use cases. For example, patch testing and prioritization. One of the big challenges for a company is deciding which patches to try work on, to test and deploy in a company, as there are so many different patches to choose from. With our framework, people can create a set of threat sensing patches and deploy them in their networks to understand which application vulnerabilities are actually being attacked in the wild, and then combine that with CVE score information and other information like threat intelligence to be able to decide which patches to prioritize. In use case number 2, we'll talk about honey patching. A honey patch closes a vulnerability inside of an application, but makes the application look vulnerable to an attacker. It's used to entice the attacker to utilize its exploit payload on an application and unveil any malware that it might use by rerouting the attacker into some sort of deceptive sandbox and collecting and monitoring information about that. Our security analysts can then take that information and use it to better protect the network and see attacks coming before they take hold. An example of a honey patching scenario would be that of Shellshock, which was a pretty significant vulnerability in Apache and Bash from a few years ago. It allowed an attacker to send a Bash command within an HTTP request to the Apache server, which would then be patched to Bash and could open up a reverse shell to the attacker, who could then basically have ownership of the server. From here, with using a honey patch, we can essentially allow the attacker to think that the attack on the Apache web server was successful, pushing it into a decoy scenario or notifying the security analyst that the attack is taking place, thwarting the attack and collecting much needed threat intelligence information. Case number 3 is Deceptive Hot-Weakening. The idea here is to take certain security aspects of an application and make them look weaker to see which types of attackers may go after that weakening. So for example, in the case of an SSH server, we might change the encryption level of the SSH to triple DES to see if an attacker will try then to crack or attack that encryption scenario on the server. Again, trying to get the attacker to unveil themselves. Our final use case is version fluxing. The idea behind version fluxing is, for example, to take an application like Apache and change its appearance to requesters. In this case, changing what version values it gives to each person that makes a request. Why this is important is because an attacker will try to fingerprint the web server. It wants to know what version the web server is so that it can devise an exploit for that server. If we continuously make the web server look like different versions, or even completely different web servers like IIS or Nginx, then we confuse the attacker and maybe they'll move on.
Hi, Fred here. Before Teryl talks about our performance benchmarks, let me show you a quick demonstration of how JIT patching works. So here I have a setup where to the left I have a terminal on my host, and to the right I have an Apache web server configured in CGI mode hosted in this virtual machine. And in particular, this web server is vulnerable against the Shellshock attack. As Teryl explained before, as an attacker I can mount a reverse shell attack against this vulnerable web server by exploiting the Shellshock vulnerability, hijacking the control flow of the application and connecting back to a reverse shell on my host machine. This essentially gives me full control over that remote machine and allows me to do any arbitrary commands against that machine. Now, with our JIT patching framework, defenders can dynamically change the behavior of the web server by injecting a honey patch that fixes the vulnerability while misdirecting the attacker to an embedded sandbox that collects attacker information. To illustrate, with the server honey patched, we now repeat the previous attack. But notice that this time, the attacker session is transparently cloned over a decoy sandbox that protects the host sensitive data and passively monitors attack activity. Notice that the honey patch only forks exploits against the patched vulnerability to decoys, leaving the original functionality of the server intact. By incorporating JIT patching in the vulnerability pre-patching routine, we can effectively minimize patching lapses, reduce operational risks, and prioritize which security vulnerabilities to target first in our environment. So this concludes our demo, and Teryl will now present the results of our performance benchmarks.
To understand the utility of our JIT patching framework, we did some benchmarks on top of a number of popular legacy applications, including Apache, Nginx, and Bind. And we used popular benchmarks such as AB, FTP Bench to conduct these analysis. We did it on both the unpatched version of the application as well as a patched version, where we took one of the main functions of these applications and patched them with our trampoline function. We found that the overhead tended to be anywhere from 2% upwards to about 10%, depending on the application, which we find to be an acceptable level of overhead, especially considering the amount of threat intelligence that we can get from these vulnerable applications, and that this is used to help prioritize vulnerabilities and help prioritize and identify attacks on our networks. Next, we wanted to assess the impact of the JIT compilation on the target server. So we took an Nginx server and ran it through a load test, a benchmark. And while we did that, we injected different patches of size, 50 lines of code all the way up to 2,000 lines of code, and measured the impact on the round-trip time of the application. We found that regardless of the size of the patch, it did not affect the performance or round-trip time of the application. For a final benchmark, we wanted to assess the impact of sandboxing overhead on the performance of the server in order to really identify whether an attacker could pick up on a timing channel that they could use to identify that they're inside of our JIT patching framework. We did this by essentially taking Apache server and using it in 3 different modes. First was a non-instrumented Apache server, which we ran the benchmark on. Next was a JIT patched Apache server, and which we didn't run any attacks on. And then third was the JIT patched server, where we did attacks and we dropped the attacker into a sandbox. And the sandbox in this case was actually a Docker container where we dropped the attacker in using setns. We found that there actually really wasn't much overhead from dropping the attacker into the sandbox, so there really isn't a timing channel in there that they can take advantage of. Next, we've been trying our framework out in more realistic environments to see how it performs. For an initial target, we took an SSH server and we injected a Deceptive Hot-Hardening patch into it to collect username, password information and to play around with the authentication controls on that application. And we basically have left it for a time period and collected data on failed attempts. And so this word cloud here shows you some of the dominant usernames and passwords that have been tried by applications. And so we could actually take some of this information and make sure that none of our other servers, none of the users on our other servers are using any of these particular passwords that can help really benefit our servers. We want to try this in the future using more active responses and various different applications in our environments. And that concludes our presentation. We'd like to thank you for participating and for your attention. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and you can see our email addresses are on the screen. So thank you, and we hope that you have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference.